I'm going to take you in a brief journey through access to air travel, not just limited to the airline policies, but all aspects to it, especially how our airlines see access to air travel with people with lung conditions, how service providers, and I'm very happy to say that we have a contribution from MedAir. MedAir is the mother company of MedLink, a service that provides in-flight medical assistance to over 120 carriers in the world. But to understand things properly, we must remember that it's fundamental to understand there is no such thing as a disabled person, but rather a person who is confronted by a disabling environment. What does this mean? We have to ensure that accessibility, be it facilitation or be it just accessibility in terms of infrastructure, is always the focus. Now, this is also important because sometimes there is a misconception that people with lung conditions cannot access services at airports because they're thought to be for people with reduced mobility, people on wheelchairs. This is not true. As a member of the Access to Air Travel group of the advisory group of the Civil Aviation Authority in the UK, I can attest to that people with special needs, and lung conditions fall within the scope of special needs, are entitled to receive assistance both at airports and on the air. So, as Matthew was pointing out before, it is fundamental, if walking long distances at airports is a problem for you, to book assistance, because you're entitled to be moved across the terminal free of charge, no questions asked. Now, normally you would have to book at least 48 hours before your flight, because probably you're also traveling with concentrators or ventilators or other type of equipment. But in case you've already booked your assistance with the airline and you arrive at the airport and you find that the distances are too long, you can go to a special assistance desk and ask for assistance there and then, and they, by law, will need to help you. This is your right, and you must make use of it. This is the same in Europe and in the United States. Actually, in the United States, you don't have to book assistance prior to your flight. You just walk up to the airline desk and say, I'm here and I need help. Also, it is important to underline that you're entitled to the carriage of medical equipment and medicines free of charge. Now, sometimes you have to have a vetting process for medical equipment with the airline, but that doesn't remove your right to travel with it free of charge. Now, Matthew was pointing out about the cost of oxygen in flight. And as you will see later on in the presentation, certain airlines do charge for oxygen. However, it is my opinion that this should not be the case because it falls within the scope of 1107, the law that regulates access to air travel. Therefore, in order, you are entitled to receive all types of assistance to make your flight and arrive at destination. And in the case of lung conditions, oxygen is a fundamental part of this assistance. Therefore, it should be free of charge. And this is something that perhaps working with lawmakers and regulators will be important to do in the near future. So, as mentioned, I am a member of the EasyJet Special Assistance Advisory Group. Within the advisory group, we do work with all parts of the company, and I have spoken with Tim Stevenson, who is the Chief Medical at EasyJet, before coming over, and he provided me this charts in order to better understand the risk factor for people with lung condition. And as he clearly explains here, and I trust all of you are quite familiar with these charts, the hemoglobin in the red blood cells cannot hold on to oxygen at the same extent at high altitudes. And therefore, anyone with a pre-existing medical condition who has already rendered them less efficient at absorbing oxygen can drop down that precipitous graph, meaning that lower concentrations of oxygen are reaching every cell engine room. The decrease in ambient pressure in the cabin at normal cruising altitude will cause any gas to increase in volume by approximately 30%. Also, as the plane starts to descend, the gradually increasing cabin pressure leads to a reduction in volume. Gas expansion of 30% could lead to problems in those with recent lung damage or pneumothorax, for instance, or those who had recently operations or have been placed in or air has been placed in body cavity, like eye operations, brain surgery, or laparoscopy. Now, this is very important, I think, for physicians in the room. When assessing the fitness to fly of a person with lung conditions, physicians need to consider many issues, but the gas expansion or contraction and the issue of gas exchange and hypoxia are critically important. So how do airlines determine the fitness to fly? Because normally, as a patient or as a physician, you would say, well, it's, the degree or the extent of the condition of the patient. Well, it's not only that, of course. That is the first part, the risk to the individual. But there is also the risk to fellow passengers and crew, distress or death. Unfortunately, I am aware of 3 cases in the last 6 months of people with lung conditions that passed away, 2 on long-haul flights and 1 on a short-haul flight. So it is rare, but unfortunately can happen. The risk of a diversion. A flight diversion occurs when Medlink tells the captain, yes, you need to land the aircraft at an airport we are going to tell you, because the way Medlink operates is not they are going to arrange for a diversion to the closest airport. They are going to arrange to a diversion to the airport that's closest to the best medical assistance team for that particular condition. So the flight may last 20 minutes longer, but they're going to land the plane in the right place. Again, this will cost some money. The financial implications, therefore, of a diversion, and the interaction with repatriation companies should things go very bad, in the sense that you have a person that has to be airlifted back home in an air ambulance, or in worst case scenario when you have repatriation of a body. Now, it's good to have an understanding of how much a diversion costs, and I've been speaking with Emirates about this. This will give you an insight of how many diversions, what's the incidence of diversions on the overall flight operation of the airline. They had 60 flight diversions last year, over 194,000 flights. However, each diversion had a cost between $50,000 and $600,000. There was actually one where there was a head of state and his family traveling in first class, and the cost of the diversion went above $1 million because, of course, they had to source a private jet to go and take the head of state out of the place. But anyways, so we can have a median cost for a long-haul flight of $300,000 per diversion. So you can easily understand why airlines are a little bit wary and very demanding when you approach them with a lung condition, because this factor is part of the equation when they evaluate the risk of carrying a person with a lung condition. Now, going into policies. I've spoken with Norwegian. Norwegian is in up and coming in the no-frill segment of airlines. I chose them as key policy because they operate both short-haul and long-haul flights, and therefore they have a mixed scenario. Also, they fly to the United States, and the United States are covered by different legislation, slightly different legislation. That's 14 CFR Part 3A2. The difference between the European legislation and the American legislation is that the European legislation divides duties between airports and airlines, whereas in the United States, it's the airline that's responsible for all assistance. So what do Norwegian tells us? In general, we ask customers to bring a medical certificate if one of the more of the following applies: have had a recent illness, hospitalization, injury, or surgery, have an existing unstable medical condition, need additional oxygen or use of a medical equipment on board, a written statement signed by a licensed physician verifying that the customer is able to operate it, which is very important. If you're traveling for medical reasons or treatment, and if you're at a late stage of pregnancy. Now, what they strongly recommend is that the certificate is kept in the hand luggage at all times, as a certificate may be required at check-in and when boarding the flight. Apologies. Now, this is a bit of a stretch, in my opinion, because if you have booked assistance and you have made yourself aware to the airline already has all your information. That goes into a very short message called SSR, Special Service Request. So technically, when you report to check-in or when you report at the gate, the operator already knows who you are and what your needs are. But again, they require a medical certificate, and it's always best to exceed than fall short. Essential medication and medical equipment may be taken on board without any additional cost, as said. Bring extra medication in case of potential emergency or delays, and we will go back to this one. They strongly recommend that medication and medical equipment should be packed separately from other luggage and kept in the hand luggage. Now, the issue of hand luggage can be a bit tricky because some airlines tend to put limits on the hand luggage. However, if your hand luggage comprises medicines or medical equipment, this is transported again free of charge and therefore is not subject to those limits. It's important that you know that because sometimes flight attendants, cabin crew, or check-in staff are not aware of that. So it's good to remind them. Customers need to bring all essential equipment by themselves. This does also include oxygen, as the oxygen supply on board is only for emergencies. Now, the issue of emergencies, as I said before, it is my opinion that oxygen should be made available to passengers free of charge and should be available on board for people with lung conditions without restrictions. There is an issue. And as you know, weight is an issue for airlines. Each additional kilo of freight is a cost for the airline. And that translates in several thousands of dollars at the end of the year. So it's a mathematical equation. But again, under 1107, airlines are under the obligation of transporting wheelchairs of any type, including electric wheelchairs that can weigh up to 250 kilos free of charge. Therefore, the issue of weight, since it's limited to a flight, should not be a discriminatory issue like it is today. As you probably and physicians in this room are aware, cabin crew are not authorized to give prescription medications to passengers. Therefore, if somebody needs to take prescription medication and does not feel comfortable flying alone, he or she should fly with a companion. Companions, of course, are authorized to do that. Now, there is talking about bringing oxygen on board. You must let the airline know, as we said, 48 hours in advance. Oxygen, air cylinders, and oxygen concentrations shall be booked in advance. A medical certificate must be provided. Check-in staff and cabin crew must be informed if the customer is traveling with oxygen. The oxygen cylinder, including valve and regulator, must not exceed 5 kilos in total. Devices containing liquid oxygens are forbidden, and this is not discriminatory. This is a matter of safety regulations. The oxygen concentrator device must be carried on board with the intent to use it during the flight. And here you have a list of commonly accepted devices. So if you want to take pictures or you want to take note, I don't know if this presentation will be made available after the conference, but it's always a good chart to have. Safety assistant. As I said, companion or safety assistant. You will be required to travel with a safety assistant if you are unable to fasten or unfasten your seatbelt on your own, if you are unable to retrieve a life vest on your own, to reach an emergency exit unaided, which means that if you can drag yourself to the emergency exit, you will be allowed to fly solo. Fit an oxygen mask. Understand safety instructions given by the cabin. Here, there is a point where the two legislations, the American and the European, differ. In Europe, airlines are recommended to give discounted rates, discounted fares to travel companions, but they're not under the obligation to do so. In the United States, if an airline imposes a travel companion on you, but you say, no, I do not require it, and still the airline says, no, I want you to travel with a companion, your companion will travel free of charge because that's on request of the airline. Now, this covers travel within the United States and to and from the United States. At the airport, but we'll come back to the airport without Norwegian in a moment. Now, I've then spoken to Virgin Atlantic Airways. Geraldine Lundy is their head of accessibility, and she works in close relationship with the medical team. So she says, we ask the customer to provide us with the detail of the equipment they want to use, and then we check it against our list maintained by our engineers. The list details all equipment that will not interfere with critical systems on board the aircraft, so we know that it will not adversely affect aircraft safety. If an item is not on the list and we haven't come across it before, our engineers will check with the manufacturers to assess if it can be cleared for travel and use on board. On our airline, we ask that all medical equipment is battery operated and that the customer carries battery sufficient for 130% of the length of the aircraft journey. This is because we do not have medical power available on our aircraft, and we do not have power at every seat. In addition, even if we have power at a seat, it may not be sufficient to power the customer's equipment. Alternatively, if there is an issue with power, potential fire on the aircraft, that in-seat power is shut down, we would not want a customer whose respirator or ventilator depends to find the power has it cut out. This is why we only clear battery-operated equipment. Now, this is very, very important, I believe. And our next slide... Oh, sorry. Sorry, I skipped it. MedAir, as I said, is the company that operates MedLink. In 2016, at least 80 in-flight events where reported assistance was needed because a POC was running out of battery. So again, stress on battery. There are several possible contributing factors. The fact that battery consumption might be increased at altitude as the settings need to be adjusted accordingly, and most likely because the passenger is adjusting to achieve a comfortable level of O2. One of those cases diverted because the oxygen supply also extinguished on board. In addition, we also had 116 cases where MedLink doctors categorized the case as COPD related. 3 of them were diverted. So let's go back to the 4 golden rules for a seamless journey. Never make assumptions. Assumptions are the mothers of all mistakes. So when in doubt, consult with the airline. This is especially for physicians, because sometimes your patient isn't aware of all the implications of accessing air travel, but you should be. Be self-sufficient. Do not rely on the airline's emergency kit and emergency oxygen. They, until we clarify the issue of oxygen availability, they will tell you you cannot use it because it's only for emergencies, we don't have enough, all the things you may think about. Ensure you have plenty of medical supplies because you may incur in infections and you need to have your medical supplies. And it's a good policy to be redundant. So have part of your supply in your checked luggage, part of your supplies in your hand luggage. So whatever happens, you are covered. Ensure that you have more than enough battery power. As we have seen, battery is an issue. To guarantee your concentrator or ventilator can continue to operate, even if you experience a long delay, a diversion, a delay due cancellation of the original flight. Now, in the last 20 years, I think I've taken in excess of about 1,000 flights, and I recall only twice I've been involved in a rapid descent due to cabin pressurization, and that can be a problem. But I have experienced far more delays, hard delays, and cancellation. I would say that about 65% of all the flights I've taken in the last 20 years were delayed of at least 30 minutes or more. So be prepared, because a delay can cause problems when you are in flight. Now, as I said, I come bearing gifts today. You need to make your concerns heard. It's important, it's very, very important that the aviation industry hears your concerns and understands your needs. Dialogue will help all sides have a better understanding of the issues at stake and will ultimately result in making every journey better for everyone. Now, I am absolutely thrilled and delighted to have been authorized by the Civil Aviation Authority to invite the European Lung Foundations to join the Access to Air Travel Advisory Group of the CAA. This will be formalized in the coming days. And I'm also absolutely thrilled to invite the European Lung Foundation to come and have their concerns heard in the future meeting. I think it's going to be December or January, of the Heathrow Access Advisory Group. As we said, airports can be a bit of a hurdle. In the last fortnight, I was appointed chair of the Access Group of Heathrow, and therefore it is with great pleasure that I invite you, because, you know, if we need to jumpstart this dialogue, and in order to jumpstart it, we need to create the opportunities. And here we have 2, and I have a third one. I ran it last night by the chair of the EasyJet Special Assistance Advisory Group, Lord David Blunkett. And he will be very happy to have the European Lung Foundations come to express and make a presentation at a future meeting of ESAG, so that we can listen and hear. And probably Tim Stevenson of the Chief Medical will also be there. So again, we can make progress with the dialogue. Thank you.
Fantastic talk, Roberto. Thank you very much. Thank you for the updates at the end there. I think that's going to be very welcome news for a lot of patients and patient organisations as well, so thank you very much. Any questions from the audience at all? Okay. How realistic do you think it is, in your opinion, that what we need to happen for patients can be standardised across all airlines, across all countries? Is that a dream too far, or do you think that might be a realistic possibility?
Let me give you an example, and this is the experience in the UK. Up to 2014, airports were assisting passengers with special needs, and each airport was doing it their own way. Most importantly, one was calling it help desk, the other was calling meeting point, the other was calling special assistance. So it took 2 years for the regulator, to the CAA, to get on board with the problem. But finally, in 2014, they issued guidance for airports to use common terminology across the board, that's special assistance. So at every airport you go in the UK, you will find that common terminology, special assistance. This is crucial because everybody knows what they will be looking for, regardless if they're in Glasgow or London or Belfast. So it takes time, but it's definitely doable.
Thank you. Yep, got a question over here.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering, why is it that the oxygen in the cabin is lower? Isn't it possible to just increase the oxygen level in the cabin, and then we can avoid all this hassle?
This is very technical in the sense we go into cabin pressurization. Now, the answer to that is modern aircraft. When Matthew was talking about hydration, if you fly a more modern aircraft like a Boeing 787 or an Airbus 350, they are pressurized at the lower altitude and they have more moisture in the air, more humidity. Therefore, problems are problems are mitigated, let's put it this way. But unfortunately, on standard aircraft, and especially short-haul aircraft, this is not going to be the case. And technically, it's not undoable to lower the altitude of pressurization for the existing fleet.
Thank you. Last question.
I have a question about flight diversion and who is responsible to pay that? Because I have some patient who doesn't want oxygen. They need oxygen, but they doesn't want to travel with oxygen, and they know that perfectly, but they choose to travel. And in case of a problem in flight and the plane has to be diverted, do you know who is responsible for the cost of this problem?
Normally, the airline pays for the diversion. Normally, the only cases where passengers are charged for diversion, if there is a brawl in flight or a drunken passenger picks a fight with fellow passengers, and the situation escalates to the point that the pilot decides to land the plane at the closest airport, the passenger is chased after by the airline to recover the costs. But in case of a medical emergency, this is always on the charge of the airline.
Okay, Roberto, thank you very much.